The world did not change on the day World War II ended. It merely stopped bleeding in public, because while newspapers announced victory, while flags were raised and speeches promised a new beginning, something invisible continued to move beneath the surface of history. Something that did not appear in official photographs. Something that could not be contained in peace treaties. The war had ended on paper, but its consequences were only just beginning. Silent, deep, and irreversible. In 1945, humanity believed it had survived its own end. Destroyed cities began to be rebuilt in haste, as if concrete could erase memory. Soldiers returned home trying to relearn how to live as civilians, while carrying inside them images that would never fade. Maps were redrawn, borders adjusted, leaders judged, but none of this touched the true legacy of the conflict, because World War II was not merely a war, won or lost. It was a psychological, moral, and structural rupture that redefined how the modern world would function. More than 60 million dead do not represent just a statistic. They represent interrupted families, mutilated cultures, futures that would never exist. For the first time in history, death was not merely a consequence of combat, but a planned objective on an industrial scale. War ceased to be a confrontation between armies and became a direct assault on human existence. Civilians became strategic targets. Entire cities were reduced to ashes in a matter of hours, and the world learned, in the most brutal way possible, that civilization was far more fragile than it appeared. When silence arrived, it did not bring relief. It brought trauma, a collective, profound trauma that crossed borders and generations. Millions survived physically, but never truly returned. Soldiers who had witnessed the worst of human nature came home unable to sleep without jolting awake. Children grew up surrounded by emotionally broken adults. Families learned to live with silence, with the absence of words to describe what had been seen. The psychological suffering of the war did not end with the ceasefire. It seeped into culture, behavior, and political decisions. From that moment on, the world began to act driven by the fear of repeating the horror. But that fear, far from preventing new conflicts, began to shape a new form of violence. World War II did not merely destroy old empires, it created an artificial order sustained by permanent mistrust. Europe, which for centuries had dictated the rhythm of global history, emerged weakened, devastated, and dependent. In the vacuum left by exhausted powers, two colossal forces rose, not as silence but as inevitable opposites. The United States and the Soviet Union did not emerge as saviors of the world, but as heirs to a planet in ruins. Each carried an irreconcilable vision of the future. On one side, capitalism, the market, the promise of individual prosperity. On the other, communism, state control, the promise of collective equality. These ideas did not remain confined to speeches. They became ideological weapons. The war had not ended. It had merely changed its form. The so-called Cold War was born not from a treaty, but from the fresh memory of total destruction. The fear of another global conflict was so great that, paradoxically, it began to be avoided, not through trust, but through threat. Humanity entered an era in which peace would be maintained by terror. And the ultimate instrument of that terror was born in the final days of World War II, when two Japanese cities ceased to exist in an instant. The atomic bomb was not merely a weapon. It was a dividing line between Hiroshima and Nagasaki, marked the exact moment when humanity acquired the technical capacity to annihilate itself. From that point forward, all political decisions would be made under the shadow of total destruction. The world could never be the same, because the end ceased to be abstract. It became measurable, calculable, possible within minutes. Nuclear fear did not remain confined to war rooms. It invaded schools, homes, and cities. Children were taught survival drills for an attack they hoped would never come. Architects designed bunkers. Governments created warning systems. Films, books, and music reflected a constant anxiety, a sense that tomorrow was always uncertain. Civilization began to live in a permanent state of alert. And yet, it was precisely this fear that prevented a new direct confrontation between the great powers. Mutually assured destruction became the foundation of a fragile, unstable, artificial peace. It was not a peace built on trust or understanding, but on the certainty that whoever struck first would also be the last to exist. humanity learned to survive with its finger always near the red button. Meanwhile, far from the spotlight of nuclear rivalry, another consequence of World War II spread across the planet. The collapse of European empires opened the door to an unprecedented wave of decolonization. Peoples who had been exploited for centuries demanded independence, self-determination, freedom. The war had exposed the hypocrisy of colonial powers that fought authoritarianism while keeping millions under forced domination. But freedom arrived abruptly, disorganized, and often violently. Artificial borders, drawn on distant tables, ignored ethnic, religious, and historical identities. Newly created states inherited fragile structures, dependent economies, and deep internal tensions. Instead of stability, many of these countries plunged into cycles of coups, civil wars, and regional conflicts. World War II did not liberate the colonized world. It merely transferred the battlefield. Africa, Asia, and the Middle East became stages for indirect struggles between Cold War powers. Weapons, money, and ideologies flowed into local conflicts, fueling wars that, although distant from centers of power, were direct consequences of 1945. The world was officially at peace, but it burned in fragmented flames. In Western Europe, destruction brought a rare opportunity, the chance to rebuild entire societies almost from scratch. The trauma of war convinced governments that stability could no longer depend solely on markets or luck. States assumed unprecedented responsibilities: public health, education, social security. The welfare state was born not merely as economic policy, but as a response to the fear that misery and desperation could once again open the door to extremism. This reconstruction profoundly transformed the relationship between citizen and government. Prosperity came to be seen as a tool for peace. Consumption became a symbol of normality. Constant economic growth became not just desirable, but necessary to prevent a return to chaos. But this model also created new vulnerabilities. Economies became dependent on continuous expansion. Stability became conditional on abundance. On the other side of Europe, reconstruction followed an opposite path. Authoritarian regimes consolidated themselves under the discourse of protection against fascism. Planned economies replaced markets. Surveillance became routine. The division of the continent was not merely political or military. It was psychological. Two ways of life grew side by side, separated by visible and invisible walls, both children of the same war. Technology was another ambiguous legacy of the conflict. World War II accelerated science at a pace never before seen. Innovations created to kill were repurposed to sustain life. Medicine advanced, engineering made giant leaps. But every advance carried a dark origin. Rockets that would take humanity into space were born as missiles. Global communication systems emerged from military needs. Mass surveillance began as a security strategy. The modern world, connected, fast, technological, is largely a direct byproduct of total war. The line between progress and threat became increasingly blurred. The question ceased to be whether something could be created and became whether it should be used. Science, once viewed as a neutral force, came to be seen as morally ambiguous. As the world advanced, memory itself became a silent battlefield. Some nations confronted their past directly, grappling with guilt, responsibility, and moral reconstruction. Others chose selective forgetting, denial, convenient narratives. Monuments, school textbooks, and commemorative dates began to reflect not only history, but how each society chose to remember it. Memory ceased to be merely remembrance and became power. Where the past was distorted, the risk of repetition grew. Where trauma was silenced, it resurfaced in other forms. World War II did not end simply because the guns fell silent. It continued to live in how the world chose, or refused, to remember. Another silent consequence was the normalization of war as a permanent condition. Before 1939, conflicts were defined events. After 1945, military readiness became constant. Armies remained mobilized even in times of peace. Military budgets grew continuously. Industrial complexes came to depend on weapons production to sustain entire economies. War ceased to be the exception and became a continuous possibility. Conflicts began to be called operations, interventions, limited actions, language, softened violence, but it never disappeared. The world learned to live in constant alert, as if the next conflict were only a matter of time. Today, decades later, we still inhabit a planet shaped by decisions made in the ruins of 1945. Borders, alliances, tensions, and fears carry the mark of that conflict. The modern idea of universal human rights was born from the revelation of unimaginable horrors. But so too was born the capacity to violate those rights on an unprecedented scale. The same system that promises protection enables total surveillance. The same technology that connects enables control. Perhaps the deepest consequence of World War II does not lie in maps or treaties, but in how it redefined what it means to be human. The war taught that technical progress does not guarantee moral progress. That civilization can collapse rapidly. That barbarism is not a historical accident, but a constant possibility. World War II did not end. It dissolved into time, infiltrating institutions, behaviors, and mentalities. Its legacy is not merely historical. It is structural. It breathes in every international crisis, every arms race, every speech that divides the world into us and them. And as the 21st century advances, with new technologies, new tensions, and old ghosts returning, one question remains, echoing like a silent warning. It is not about whether we learned from World War II, but whether we are still capable of recognizing its consequences before they cease to be echoes of the past and once again become the deafening sound of the present.